So then to go with what you were saying further, that it's not really a matter of theology, but authority, and the church hasn't figured out. I guess I would want to ask, do you think the church really even wants to figure it out? Because I'll never forget somebody who was giving me advice before I was ordained a priest. And they thought they were giving me really good advice, but I was sort of like, ew. They said, just remember, the only thing that you really control is the distribution of the sacraments. And I said, I was like, yeah, in some practical sense, because of the way our authority structure is, right? Because we don't have lay Eucharistic presidency. It requires the presence of a bishop or a priest. And it makes me wonder, what do we even want to get to the place where half our congregation chooses to stay home on a Sunday and participate digitally, like, because we lose some of that sense of authority of who gets to do what with the sacrament, what happens to it,
Well,
because if
because
we
the entire structure of the church begins to break down when you make that jump, right? Because if you can participate in communion outside of space and time,
right,
like, why do we need a priest in each city?
do we you know yeah, I think that's the questions we're asking, right? Like, that I don't think the institutional form wants to ask.
And but then we have to ask ourselves, like, is the authority structure, the way that we've set it up now, really a reflection of Christ's sort of perpetual self emptying,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, we talked last week about how it's our job to work ourselves out of the job,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, and on the other hand, I sort of, I want to walk back. I do think that having really well trained pastors
Right.
in local congregations is important,
Absolutely.
right? And you need
Absolutely.
only look at sort of like um, the effectiveness of like volunteer chaplain programs versus paid chaplain programs to
Right.
sort of illustrate that difference, right? But
100%. Right.
that there is something about having really well trained folks, right? But does that have to be the priesthood, and does that have to be um, yeah, it's an interesting line of questioning.
When you were asking about the self-emptying of Christ, my mind went to this question, which is, on the cross and then continuing throughout history, has Christ only been emptied into the church and onto the altar, or has Christ been emptied into the whole world? And I think we know what Paul would say, right? Christ is in all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in God we live and move and have our being. Um, Again, to go back, Christ in me, the hope of glory. Um, when Peter talks about that we are already participating in the divine nature. So there's something about, we have, by building our common life around the place at which you can, only go to get this one thing, right? Maybe we should never have done that at all.
Right, and sort of where I the danger in that is we need only sort of look at churches which do not value sacraments
Right.
and sacramentality and sacramental leadership
Right.
to see, I'm thinking of that. Those are sort of highlighted to us as examples of what happens when you do away with the priesthood, or when you make communion something which is memorialism without any sort of real
Mm-hmm.
presence, and what happens when you don't have professional clergy, or when you don't have professionally trained clergy, I guess I should say,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily professional clergy, but clergy who've been trained professionally.
Yeah.
Um, and that they're not really coping with any of this any better than we are.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting answer, or it's an interesting question that it doesn't seem like, because I would sort of consider Catholicism and Catholic, you know, uh, Catholicism and self-professed Catholic little c churches on one side of that spectrum, and then sort
Mm-hmm.
of, you know, full gospel charismatic traditions on the other. Like neither extreme seems to be coping with doing church at home very
Right.
well.
Right. Right.
Even though that's the root of our tradition, right? The church started in people's homes.
Yeah. Uh, what sometimes it feels like to me though is, so there's, the image of the temple veil being torn when Jesus dies, right? Which to me is, you can read it one of two ways. One, that the veil is torn open so you can see that there was nothing in there at all in the first place, right? Um, and that it's always been elsewhere. Or you can say it's representative that this, we now have access to direct contact with God, right? That it doesn't need to be mediated. Sometimes a lot of this just feels like we've just hung up another veil and called it something else. Right.
Right. Or one of the metaphors that um, a really good friend of mine used to talk about in seminary was, when you're walking around and you find this really shiny, valuable thing, and then you build, in order to honor how beautiful it is, you build this really shiny, beautiful box. And then someone else years later finds the box and is like, oh my goodness, this is a beautiful box. Let me build a box for this box.
Yeah.
Right. And so what we've got is sort of like this nesting doll
Right.
effect, where like we're having to peel back sort of layers of the church really dealing with questions of its own authority, not really dealing with questions of theology,
Yeah. That's
right?
interesting.
In order to get to where the meat is in all of this. It's because we know, right, that if God is present everywhere, um, that God can be made digitally present, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's really us, right? Like
Right.
it it's
Yeah.
us that are sort of stuck.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I'm assuming that we'll be still be dealing with something like this next week. So next week when we chat, we'll we can keep going.
I'll watch the video and find something we were uncomfortable talking about for us to to follow up on next week.
All right. Well, I think
But it
that's
was,
it for us today. Um, we do hope you're enjoying this. We are. We're trying to make the best of it. And if you've got questions or comments, leave them in the comments below the videos. And let us know how we can serve you.
yeah. And maybe, and maybe your comments will highlight some other thing that we're all sort of uncomfortable with that we can talk about. And
Yes, that'd be awesome.
we're all about leaning into the uncomfortable here at
That's right.
Man, we went to some wacky places today.
We did. Oh, we're still recording.
Yeah, we are. Sorry. But yeah, it was good hanging out with you, man.
It was good. I thought it was a good discussion.